The 1980s, the decade immediately prior to the fall of the USSR. Everyone can sense change in the air as the communist state's grasp on Russia and Eastern Europe weakens. Its communication becomes more porous, and news begins slipping past the Iron Curtain. Alongside the more mundane flow of information, researchers in the Western Bloc start getting wind of strange encounters plaguing the Soviet Union. In fact, activity in the USSR would pick up so much that by the end of the decade, that ufologist Jacques Vallée would dub the influx of reports the Glasnost wave, referencing the increased transparency with which the Soviet Union operated under its final leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. As we will see, however, the strangeness from Eastern Europe was confined neither to Russia nor the UFO phenomenon. One of the epicenters of paranormal activity in the 1980s was a region on everyone's mind today, Ukraine. As we look at Ukrainian accounts from this decade, it is important to remember that these phenomena, whatever they truly represent, don't seem to play by our rules or logic. In fact, some stories are more wild than others, and many cases can't be tied up in a nice, tidy little bow. Some may be true, some may be tall tales. Yet, even when they push the boundaries of what we conventionally accept, there are simply too many stories to be ignored. It certainly seems as if something from somewhere else made its home in the Ukraine in the 1980s. In fact, we're going to look at quite a few. In a prior installment, we mentioned a possible UFO recovered by Soviet scientists in 1947 from beneath Kyiv. Well, that discovery, the story goes, that had crashed on Earth thousands of years in the past. However, Ukrainian UFO researcher Anton Afilov claimed the Soviet Union got its hands on another UFO on April 15, 1980, but this time downed by military ordnance, and according to Afilov, air defense radar tracked several objects of unknown origin in Ukraine's sky, alarming leadership enough for them to scramble their fighter jets. Several MiG aircraft were deployed, and one of them, whether authorized to or not, successfully opened fire on what appeared to be an aerial disc. The pilot confirmed his rocket struck the mysterious aircraft, and soon afterwards, helicopter search teams carrying a dozen men found the crashed flying saucer. According to the story, all personnel arriving to the area were then issued hazmat suits and Geiger counters, which registered an abnormal amount of radiation at the crash site. From their vantage point on the ground, they could see that it was indeed a vehicle of some sort, around 85 feet wide and at least 16 feet tall, topped by a gently sloping cupola. The debris field yielded bits and pieces of what was obviously some sort of advanced technology. Unlike conventional aircraft, no wires, bracing struts, or circuitry were recognizable among the remnants. An enormous crack from the MiG's missile had split the saucer right down the middle, granting the salvage crew access inside. Ornamental inscriptions, not unlike the Sanskrit found in the UFO from 1947, were all visible throughout the interior. This time, however, the craft's pilots were recovered. Two short, almost dwarven corpses with large heads. From there, the story follows every other UFO crash narrative. Both the wreckage and the bodies were predictably whisked away by governmental authorities, this time transported to a military airfield just south of Sverdlovsk in Russia for initial examination. And for over 2 weeks, the craft was studied before being shipped off to Moscow, but no one was able to cover up the memories of Ukrainian eyewitnesses who had seen the dogfight unfold in the skies above their very eyes. Because of these witnesses on the ground, this story had received additional follow-ups. Another story about downed flying saucers would eventually emerge from Ukraine. Records indicate the year was 1981, though this could easily be an investigative oversight or the result of faulty memories. This seems likely because the story is practically identical to the one from the year before, a large non-terrestrial aircraft downed in the vicinity of a Ukrainian airbase, subsequently recovered by military personnel. If we assume the stories describe the same event, we learn some of the additional details about the craft. It came down in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, and more closely resembled a flattened egg or oval than a true circle, sporting numerous pointed protrusions all across its hull. No doors, windows, portholes, or any seams of any type were readily apparent. The official story, meant to dissuade curious onlookers and low-ranking soldiers, was that it was simply a crashed Soviet aircraft. Now, when this story failed to convince anybody, the authorities pivoted to claim that it was a meteor before rushing it off to a large flatbed truck. Excavators were brought in to harvest soil from the site for analysis, which was then taken away as well. As in the 1980 story, the recovered craft was moved to a nearby airbase before making the long trek to Moscow. Now, this version of the story presents a very intriguing epilogue. You see, 12 years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Russian military partnered in a secret deal with covert American operatives to have the UFO transported to an airbase in Greenland, today, home of the U.S. Space Force northernmost base. From there, it was taken to an undisclosed location in the continental United States, perhaps Area 51, since it does harbor more than just the Roswell crash. The following year, a Ukrainian citizen would make much more peaceful contact with otherworldly beings in his home at 37 Ukrainsia Street in Simferopol, Crimea. A word of warning, what follows is both bizarre and graphic. Yuri Vazulovich Zabroy was living a calm, happy life as an electrician. In fact, the only thing concerning him when he came home the evening of April 17, 1982, was the fact that his lovely wife had been experiencing horrible headaches for several days prior, and neither of them knew why she was being forced to endure such crippling migraines. The pain was leading to endless nights of insomnia. Tonight, however, the headaches seemed to subside a bit, and all was well. Yuri had settled down around 8 p.m. when he noticed the light bulbs throughout his house had begun dimming on their own. An aggravation for most of us, but a point of pride for an electrician. He went to the fuse box and found several had been blown. Yuri switched them out in short order, thinking he had satisfactorily diagnosed the problem. Yuri then returned to his living room, but the lights dimmed again. Had his replacement fuses been faulty? Aggravated, he grabbed a new set of fuses, but the problem still persisted. And by now, it was growing late. Since they were getting ready for bed anyway, Yuri simply turned off the power to the house and decided to address the issue in the light of day. He then slid in beside his wife, perturbed but not concerned, and the hours passed secondly until the wee hours of the morning. That's when Yuri found himself unexpectedly awake. In a corner of the bedroom, he could see the plaster on the wall softening, almost as if it were melting away. Was he dreaming? And with an inexplicable compulsion, he found himself walking toward the wall until he was seized in place by some invisible force. He could not move a muscle, and with great effort, he forced his hands toward the melting spot on the wall, and suddenly, the entire bedroom lit up, bright as day, as a spark flashed from the wall and into his palm. Yuri felt his entire body pulled closer to the spot as if he were magnetized. As he grew near, another light emerged from the cracking plaster, but instead of hitting his hand, took off into the room, and the tiny light flitted about like a large firefly around the size of a walnut. And as Yuri watched in complete disbelief, the object grew, revealing its true shape, a classic saucer. The light continued to expand before becoming diffuse and separating, amoeba-like, into 4 separate pieces. And by now, Yuri had more control over his body and was in a full state of panic. The amoebas, which glowed like the bright static of a television screen, drifted towards him. Getting so close, Yuri was compelled to kick at one. What kind of nightmare was this? He had asked himself. Yuri couldn't quite make sense of it, but what unfolded before his eyes could best be compared to an accelerated evolutionary process. The amoebas grew larger before taking a recognizable shape. 2 limbs, a head, then 4 limbs, until finally they had each assumed the form of a humanoid. Their luminous sheen diminished, and Yuri recognized them as 1 male and 3 females. The male, ostensibly their leader, appeared to be dressed in a normal, everyday business suit and had a bald head and a lean build. Yuri mustered a question, pointing upwards and asking, "Are you from there?" In his head, almost so sudden it seemed to be anticipating his reply, and he heard a voice say, "Yes." Yuri had come across stories of aliens abducting people from horrific experiments and was afraid, but this being sensed his apprehension. They had no plans to kidnap him, the male telepathically informed him. Instead, they were here to create human-alien hybrids. The being gestured to the 4 women in his company. They apparently wanted his permission. acting with the unsensible logic normally reserved for dreams. Yuri agreed to whatever they had planned for him and found himself disrobing. The female entities followed in kind. And to describe what happened next delicately, the entire affair was much more clinical than Yuri expected. The male produced a syringe-type device and harvested seed from his genitalia, which he then transferred to each of the female beings through a tiny, needle-sized hole in their bodies. Yuri noted that each of the women seemed to wear some sort of device on their necks that flashed whenever the appropriate amount had been administered. Without warning, the image of all four beings diffused, and they disappeared. The next thing Yuri was aware of was him awakening in bed. As mentioned earlier, the case is bizarre, but fits neatly into much older narratives of entities trying to hybridize with human beings. It has become a trope in alien abduction stories after all. But the motif can be found far earlier. You see, this particular encounter bears a strong resemblance to ancient stories of demonic incubi and succubi who, like Yuri's aliens, would come to harvest eggs or sperm from unsuspecting victims in the dead of night. The folkloric resonance aside, Yuri Zabroi's case is far from airtight. Where was his wife when this salacious encounter unfolded? Was she still asleep in the bed? Why was he so willing to disrobe? Did his encounter occur in the astral realm, or was it simply just a dream? Apparently, Yuri was equally confused, and during the encounter he had asked the male alien if he was dreaming. He was only told that they had made it feel like a dream. In the morning, Yuri awoke feeling strange and unsettled, but in the back of his mind, he knew it couldn't have been real. It wasn't until later, though, that he began doubting himself. He was in his bedroom when something on the wall caught his eye. Something new he had not seen before, and peering a little closer, he could clearly make out a spot on the wall, newly formed to be exact, and exactly where the plaster had melted and the tiny, walnut-sized UFO had emerged into his bedroom. The Black Sea laps at Ukraine's southernmost shores. It's a notable body of water for a multitude of reasons. The Black Sea's only pathway to the Atlantic Ocean is through the Mediterranean Sea, which in turn must be reached through the narrow Bosporus Strait. This, combined with the fact that nearly a full third of European rivers, streams, and creeks drain into the Black Sea, decreases the salinity of the water and gives the sea its own unique ecosystem. In fact, many speculate that the Black Sea began its life as a freshwater lake some 22,000 years ago. But it wasn't until roughly, speculation mind you, around 7,000 to 5,000 BC that the body of water became recognizable as the Black Sea today. But no one seems to know exactly why. The more scientifically minded cite melting polar ice caps or glaciers, but some see the Black Sea as evidence for an ancient flood, famously attested to not only in the Bible's depiction of Noah and the Ark, but also other ancient epics, like those of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis. Even the ancient Greeks harbored superstitions surrounding the Black Sea. Its dark waters offer poor visibility, leading them to deem it axinos, meaning unkind to strangers. To offset this negative association, the Greeks later employed a more positive euphemism, euxinos, meaning the direct opposite, kind to strangers. And while they may have deemed the sea itself inhospitable, the Greeks, like other inhabitants, recognized the fertility of its shores, evident in Ukraine's reputation today as the breadbasket of Europe. Could the unique ecosystem of the Black Sea hold creatures found nowhere else? That seems to be the case, because it might be recalled from an earlier episode that in 1952, a witness saw something she described as a dragon scrambling off into its murky waters. Now, this was neither the first nor the last time that a sea serpent was seen in the area. In fact, such creatures have been observed in and around the Black Sea for a long time now, as early as 1828 to be exact. From Yevpatoria, a city on the Crimean Peninsula, documented sightings of enormous snakes that slithered from the sea. The creatures, whose heads were oddly compared to those of rabbits, displayed a luxurious mane of hair and would often make landfall to suck the blood from livestock. In fact, two shepherds claimed they had killed the serpents themselves after finding their sheep killed and drained of blood entirely. In fact, one instance from the late 19th or 20th century, another Ukrainian shepherd thought he had stumbled upon some sort of animal skull hiding beneath a thorn bush and struck it with his staff. It was not a skull, however. and revealed itself to be attached to a gigantic reptile. The bush flew apart as if from a small explosion, tossing clouds of dirt and thorny briars in all directions. The ensuing dust cloud obscured most of his vision, but through the haze he could make out his loyal sheepdogs attacking an immense snake which moved with monstrous speed and power. As quickly as the ordeal had begun, the beast seemed to slink away, leaving one dog dead and the other barely alive, ripped in two by the sea serpent of the Black Sea. Whether from shock, a curse, or a mere coincidence, the shepherd died shortly thereafter. Less violent encounters would occur throughout the century. In his memoir, Vsevolod Ivanov published his May 14, 1952 sighting of a serpent in the Black Sea. The writer was watching dolphins playfully hunting for mullet in the otherwise calm waters when he noticed a feature he had overlooked before. It appeared to be a large rock, maybe as big as 50 feet across, covered in algae. But as he peered closer, Ivanov tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew this part of the shoreline. It wasn't shallow there, and the rock seemed new. That's when it began moving against the current, and the surface of the object began undulating. And Ivanov could tell its underside was white, and that what he initially thought was a covering of algae was actually glistening brown skin. The massive hump dove and resurfaced a time or two, shrinking into the waters before rising again in the vicinity of the dolphins. At last, a head had appeared, ruling out any and all possibility of a whale. It seemed to belong to a serpent or snake. All told, Ivanov watched the creature for a good full 40 minutes. It seems as if the sea serpent reappeared several decades later in a series of sightings from the 1980s. At least 2 reports from the decade feature strange creatures navigating the cold waters of the Black Sea. Both involve crews of submarine operators taking the Soviet Bentos 300 vessel into the depths. The Bentos, which was named for its ability to dive 300 meters, was only at a third of that depth, around 330 feet, on this particular excursion in the summer of 1983. From the view afforded by one of the craft's tiny portholes, one of the crew spied a long, serpentine shape coiling lazily in the murky water. Unlike Ivanov, this witness described the shape as a shimmering silver, going so far as to suggest, incredibly, that it might have been even wearing a silver suit. The submarine operator called his crew member over to observe this beast, which allegedly was surveying them with immense eyes that conveyed a shocking amount of intelligence. As one of the witnesses fetched his camera to snap a photograph, the serpent shimmying into the depths and was never seen again. Or was it? The next year, the crew of the Bentos 300 supposedly saw the serpent again, offering further details. This time, though, they said it seemed to be no more than 3 feet in diameter, and were confident it was not a sturgeon or any other fauna known to frequent the Black Sea. Unfortunately, and even predictably, no photographs were taken this time either, or if they were never made public. Stories of the Black Sea serpent continued on and off all throughout the intervening decades. Among the more recent accounts, although still distant from today, a fishing fleet on the Black Sea in early December of 1990 had recovered a dolphin in their nets that was horrendously mangled, displaying huge bite marks arcing across its flesh. The belly of the dolphin had been completely ripped out, and his head had been crushed by some unspeakably powerful force. Another dolphin, almost identically mutilated, was recovered by fishermen again the next year. There are even reports of strange eggs washing around the Black Sea, and in 1996, journalist Vladimir Kukuvanin described an oversized, splintered eggshell found near Cape Aya. Inside was the start of what can only be described as an abomination, a formless head connected to a rigid spine, and most unsettlingly, the embryo clearly featured 5 fingernails growing from what appeared to be a hand. What happened to this specimen remains unknown. In recent months, a small island in the Black Sea has made headlines as the war on Ukraine rages on. You may remember its name, which possibly hints at the legends of a sea serpent lurking in the surrounding waters, the tiny outcrop known as Snake Island. April 26, 1986. The core of Ukraine's Chernobyl nuclear power plant melts down. It was in fact the world's worst nuclear power plant disaster, both in terms of lives lost and cost. When all was said and done, The USSR would spend the modern-day equivalent of over 68 billion in both the initial response and the containment efforts, but for some, it was too late. In addition to first responders, the disaster took an incalculable toll on the lives of people living in the vicinity of Pripyat, who were not only displaced from their homes to escape the fallout, but who would battle radiation-induced cancers for decades to come. In fact, the magnitude of this event cannot even be overstated. If the site had not been contained, the impact on both the environment and the health of humanity would have been staggering. Thankfully, containment efforts were successful, and today, the area around power plant, known as the Chernobyl exclusion zone, has rebounded in an astounding way, with nature reclaiming the old apartment buildings and parking lots. In hindsight, Chernobyl was entirely avoidable. This disaster was caused by lax safety standards and amplified by bureaucratic hubris. It seems there may have also been warnings from beyond. In the years since the tragedy, stories have continued to emerge about a gigantic blackbird with an immense 20-foot wingspan soaring above the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the weeks preceding the accident. It was witnessed by personnel, both from windows in the control room while surveying the grounds. In one tale, 5 employees in the vicinity of the power plant watched as a black headless thing with the torso of a man, a bird's wings, and 2 glowing red eyes on its chest swooped through the skies above. When they reported the sightings to their colleagues, they were surprised to discover others had seen what came to be called the Blackbird of Chernobyl. Rumors then began spreading like wildfire amongst workers at the plant, who went on to suffer from nightmares and mysterious, harassing phone calls. These were reported to their superiors, but no one seemed to know what to do about it or anything of it. The sightings allegedly continued until the mere moments before the reactor's meltdown. And all these data points, mysterious telephone calls, a large headless humanoid flying thing above the site of an impending disaster, have led many to assume it was none other than the infamous Mothman which haunted Pripyat in the days prior to the Chernobyl disaster. Mothman became a cultural touchstone after the Silver Bridge, which connected West Virginia to Ohio, collapsing on December 15, 1967. The entire year preceding the collapse had been attended by a mysterious figure in and around Point Pleasant, West Virginia. In his seminal 1975 book, The Mothman Prophecies, researcher of the unexplained, John Keel, chronicled the sightings and the collapse, speculating that the two were somehow linked. In the years since, Mothman has been reported around a number of disasters, from Chernobyl to the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster, and so on. Mothman, or something like it, may have well appeared around Chernobyl in the weeks leading up to the disaster. However, the claims remain contentious and preeminent, with cryptozoologists like Lauren Coleman proclaiming there exists not one thread of evidence that anything resembling a large winged humanoid appeared in the Ukrainian skies at the time. Others, like author Nick Redfern, seem to think that the stories of the Blackbird of Chernobyl had evolved out of an afterword John Keel issued in a 1991 reprint of the Mothman Prophecies, which alludes to odd phenomena in the vicinity of little Russian towns near Soviet atomic reactors. No one can say for certain, though, except for the people in Pripyat that spring morning in 1986. The stories endure, and the specter of Mothman continues to grow, striking fear of impending doom into the hearts of anyone who sees strange things in the sky. On May 8, 1987, Grigory Vasilievich Chernoshenko reappeared on his farm near Dmitrovo, Ukraine. He felt intensely fatigued to the extent that he was barely able to walk and could not keep any food down. His wife and other area police officers wanted to know where he had been for the past 5 days. While he certainly had an amazing story to tell, Grigory was shocked to tell his mind he had only been missing for a few hours. But on May 3rd, his wife had asked him to round up their turkeys as it had grown dark. He obliged, but soon found to his surprise that the gates of their farmyard had opened on their own, drawing his eyes to a large flying saucer parked just beyond. He had watched in confusion as a pair of figures in black emerged from the object and commanded him to sit down, an act which somehow whisked him into the ship. His surroundings had then changed, and he was sitting in a comfortable chair in a sterile cockpit, accompanied by 2 men dressed in black and a woman in a radiant white garment. What on earth is happening, he wondered. In response, one of the beings told him he was to accompany them on a flight, and he watched as stars appeared in a gigantic windshield before him. By now, the farmer was beside himself. He had children to take care of and had no desire to leave this planet. The beings ignored his protest, instead swabbing the inside of his mouth several times with some sort of odd white paste, and inundating him with questions he later could not recall. After a time, he watched the stars in the window slowly give way to clouds, then a pastoral landscape below. Was this some strange alien planet? Questions whirled about in his mind as he stepped out of the craft and into the sunlight. The area didn't look much different from his homeland, full of rolling pastures and small cottages. The trees seemed to be in full bloom, but other than his handful of details, he had little time to take in his surroundings as the beings commanded him back into their ship. He then lost all memory. And then, when he had regained consciousness, he was stumbling back through the front gate of his farm towards law enforcement officers and his wife. What had happened to him, and where did he go? If we remove the flying saucer and the travel of outer space, what we have here resembles countless stories from older folklore. A travel to the realm of fairies, perhaps, or even a near-death experience. 1988 would prove to be a tumultuous year for Kharkiv resident Irina Subotina. From January onward, her home was plagued by strange intruders, though whether these were from the great beyond or outer space remains anyone's guess. In one of her earliest experiences, Irina had been sound asleep beside her husband when she opened her eyes and behold a glowing circle on the ceiling of their bedroom. From inside this radiant portal, a strange dark-haired man appeared and looked directly at her. And as the moments dragged on, two more figures emerged within the circle. Another man, this one sporting a beard, and a small child wearing old-timey clothing. The child appeared to dart inland out of view, almost as if on a swing set, and without warning, an invisible hand grasped Irina's wrist and something slipped into bed beside her. She was paralyzed until she finally jerked her arm away and cried out. It would be easy to dismiss this as a bout of sleep paralysis if not for the events of that summer. See, when she was wide awake, Irina was alone at home when she began to feel as if somebody else was in the house. Rounding a corner, she saw, to her amazement, several men sitting at a table near her open balcony door. They were tall and muscular, and Irina would later compare them to classic Viking stereotypes. One of them stopped and approached her, taking her by the hand as that familiar sense of paralysis returned, and he drug her towards the balcony until she mustered a shout and the apparitions had vanished. Were these ghosts, or perhaps time slips that allowed Irina to peer into the distant past? There's a long history of Viking incursions and even governance in Ukraine, and Kharkiv, nestled along a river, would have undoubtedly been visited by them as they made their way along the country's many waterways. By the end of the 80s, Ukraine and the Soviet Union more broadly were entering the beginning of the Glasnost wave, which would persist through the mid-1990s. This period saw a noticeable jump in the number of odd reports, particularly of the UFO variety. One of the earliest Ukrainian alien abductions from this period comes from the spring of 1989 when Nikolai Kolnikov, a day laborer, was on his way to visit his relatives in Zhonkoy. Along the way, his trail took him through a narrow gorge which opened up into a wider space where a mammoth gray egg-shaped craft sat on landing struts, obstructing his path. Nikolai could see several figures just loitering around the landed vehicle. Each was short and, in his description, resembled a hairless dwarf. The next thing he knew, a blinding flash of light filled his vision, and he was back in the gorge. All he could recall were snippets of being inside some strange, high-tech space, the sensation of motors rumbling beneath him, and watching helplessly as horrible faces looked down upon him. Despite the influx of UFO reports during the Glasnost wave, a broad spectrum of beings began filling Ukrainian researchers' files towards the end of the 1980s, and one particular event took place on September 21, 1989, when 3 night watchmen near Kharkiv spotted an intruder in the orchard that they were watching. The bravest among them pursued the figure, cornering it in the underbrush, and was shocked to discover the trespasser was simply not of this world. Its face looked human enough, but its mouth was oversized, bristling with yellow fangs, and its body was covered in a dense, short fur. The man-ape took advantage of the night watchman's surprise and seized him, squeezing him close to its chest. He struggled to break free, but the creature was stronger than any man he had ever grappled with, and he could only call out for help. Thankfully, his coworkers followed the sound of his voice, quickly arriving on the scene with a length of rope of which they bound the monster's arms. The trio of security guards were at a loss regarding what to do with their new captive. The only course of action they could agree upon was to handle it like any other intruder. They forcibly escorted the creature to their car, tossing it in the back seat, and the beast began to struggle, tugging at its restraints until one of the more cautious men decided to check and make sure the doors were locked. As he did so, the creature violently kicked the door open and fled into the night, clawing its restraints away as it disappeared among the apple trees. Finally, we had the testimony of an electrical worker performing maintenance deep underground in a mine near Donetsk on his night shift. It was around 3 a.m. on August 27, 1989, when the witness spotted two unauthorized figures at the end of the railcar tracks. Seized with an irrational fear, he wisely hid behind the electrical box he was working on to get a better look, and the pair seemed to be walking the length of the track, stopping to look closer at the rails every couple of steps. The witness finally mustered the courage to confront the figures, asking who they were and what they were doing. He took several steps forward before he was stopped in his tracks by the features he made out in the dim light of the mine. The two creatures appeared to be short dwarves with shallow inhuman faces. Even their clothes were out of place, as they were dressed in silvery jumpsuits complete with screens on their chest, displaying images similar to a radar or oscilloscope. Luckily for the witness, the beings seemed just as surprised as he was and remained motionless as well. Whatever they had been doing, they realized they had been caught red-handed and turned to leave. And as they did so, they levitated just above the floor of the mine and drifted around a corner, leaving the witness sufficiently spooked. The 1980s may have been coming to a close, but the glasnost wave was just beginning. As we'll see in future installments, the 1990s brought turmoil to the USSR, and with it came even more Ukrainian tales of monsters and aliens from other worlds. If you're eager to hear more of these stories, many of the accounts in this episode come from the database of Albert Rosales, who has collected more than 18,000 humanoid encounters over the years. You can check out Albert's books at the link below. As always, guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to go ahead and slap that like button and leave a comment down below. Also, if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and hit the subscribe button and make sure you keep your notifications on so that way YouTube will let you know every time I release a great new piece of content. As always, guys, keep an open mind, and I can't wait to see you all in the very next episode.